So my name's Missy, or Melissa King. I'm one of the psychologists over at Counseling Services. So a couple of things before we start. So for anyone who's Zooming in and watching this, if you want to type your questions into the chat function, and then I'll respond to those at the end. You're muted right now, and that helps prevent you from just being a booming voice that comes in from nowhere. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in by chat. As I mentioned to you all who are here, the session is recorded. The nice thing about that is then we'll edit it and post it online, so if you want to go back and look at anything we talked about or anything like that, you can do that. It takes us a few weeks to get it posted online. So, so today we're going to talk about ableism, in particular ableist language, even though ableism can encompass a whole lot of different aspects of kind of our everyday life. And so we'll touch on some of those other aspects of ableism, but primarily it's going to be about language. So I always like to start presentations with talking a little bit about, I'm going to move this, what brings us here. Actually, I'm going to take it away altogether. Because I think it's helpful to have some context. So it'd be helpful for me to know why you're joining me here today, and I'll also talk a little bit about what brings me here. So to start off with, I'm going to have you talk to each other just a little bit, so don't worry about the microphone at this point. But go ahead and introduce yourself to somebody that you don't know, so that might mean you have to like talk between aisles or across aisles or something like that. So introduce yourself, share a reason that brought you to the presentation today, and maybe something that you're hoping to learn about, and then we can talk about it amongst ourselves as well. All right? So, go.
Really? Okay. Okay. For a statistics one, so.
Cool. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about maybe some common reasons, if any of you had common reasons for coming today or common things you're hoping to learn. So now it's on to you. You want to flip that mic on, and anybody want to share kind of what brought them? I know it's like really awkward with the microphone. I wish we didn't have to do that.
I guess I can share why I came.
Okay, will you talk into
I
it?
came because we had to go to a seminar for our speech class.
Gotcha.
And this looked pretty interesting.
Okay. Well, I hope that it will be. Anything about ableism, ableist language you're hoping to learn or get out of this?
No, I'm not really sure. I don't really know a whole lot about ableism, so I'm just eager to learn about it, I guess.
Cool. Like kind of intro, what are we talking
I
about?
literally know nothing about it, so this will be new.
Cool. How about others? How many of you are here for speech class? Oh, like all but one. Cool. All right. Well, I hope I don't disappoint. Right? Things that people are hoping to learn, maybe beyond just an observation of a speech. What'd you say?
What's ableism like an ableist?
Yeah, so what is ableism? We're totally going to talk about what it is. So that's a great place to start, is what is this, for sure. Anything else that people are hoping to get out of this? Or kind of prompted you to come to this talk versus a different speech? Okay. Well, so I'll talk a little bit about what brought me here, why I give this talk, because these catch-outs are cool because they give us the option to talk about a whole lot of different topics. And so for me, it's really important for me to do topics, to talk about topics that are related to things like social justice and diversity. I think that one of my responsibilities, so when we talk about ableism, and I'll define it in a second, But I'm somebody who currently has quite a bit of able-bodied privilege. There's not a lot that's troubling me or that's kind of leading me to a place where I'm differently abled or disabled. And so I think one of my responsibilities with that privilege is to be able to talk about it and share that information with other people. So today, my hope in our time together is that you're going to get that question, what is ableism? We're going to talk about what the definition of it is, talk a little bit about why it's important to be talking about ableism or be aware of what ableism is, provide some examples of ableist language. So how do you spot it in our kind of everyday conversations? Come up with some alternatives. So if you decide that you maybe want to take on this like reducing the ableist language that you use, what are some other words and phrases you might use instead? And then also addressing it when other people use it. So not just changing your own language, but maybe increasing the awareness of the people around you. So that's the hope for today. That's my plan. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to ask. If something's not clear, I want it to be clear, so let me know. So let's start with the basics. What is ableism? So do any of you have any ideas of what it is or what it might be based on what just the word is? I really don't like to call on people because I feel like it puts people on the spot. So my preference is that someone would just give us a guess, but I will call if no one will say anything. Yeah, thanks for...
Okay, so I just read like when I was looking up what it was, and I saw it has something to do with disabilities. So I'm assuming it has something to do with like along the lines of like physical limitations in some way. I really don't know, but
Yeah, yep. So you got us like 90% of the way there. Yep, it has to do with different abilities, disabilities. When y'all see the word ism or the ending ism, what are some of the things you think of? You know, like if we're talking about maybe racism or sexism or heterosexism, like what are the things that those all have in common? Exactly. Yep. So that's what it is. It's discrimination or prejudice against people with diverse abilities. So there's been kind of a movement away from the term disability because that implies like the person has a defect or a dysfunction, and towards using language like diverse abilities or differing abilities. And there's a whole big rationale for that I'm not going to go into a lot of depth of, but I think it's important to know that there's kind of a move away from disability. So some things to know about ableism. Well, first, so separating discrimination and prejudice, because they're different things, but we often use them sort of interchangeably. So prejudice is really attitudes or beliefs about an individual based on their group membership, okay? And discrimination is how that plays out either in behaviors that an individual might express, or maybe the way it plays out in sort of how the society gets set up, okay? So discrimination, for example, might show up before we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. If buildings didn't have to have ramps for people in wheelchairs to get into them, right? Like all of a sudden there's discrimination. A whole chunk of people can't enter this building because they physically can't get into it. So that's the difference between prejudice and discrimination. It's important to note, like, of course these actions can be overt and explicit, but usually they come out in really subtle ways, and a lot of times they get expressed by people who don't even realize they're expressing them. And they're not intentionally trying to do any harm. It's just sort of embedded in our society. And we don't always pay close attention to it or how it can impact people. Ableism tends to come from stereotypes we have about what's considered to be normal or typical, okay? So with just this definition, I'm curious, what are some ideas that are popping into your head of like what could be ableist language, or what could be ableist, like a societal setup or something like that. All right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to call on somebody. Do you have any ideas about an example of ableism?
In terms of language.
Yes, that's a great example. So she said the word retarded. Okay, so I'm going to use the R word because I don't like saying that word. But that's a great example. And actually, that word has been recognized as so kind of problematic and harmful that it used to be a diagnostic category. So we used to diagnose mental retardation if their IQ was below a certain point. And we've actually taken that out of the diagnostic system, and we use the term intellectual disability now, because in a lot of ways we've found that that language is actually more harmful than it is helpful to have that diagnosis. So that's a great example. Some other ideas of what might be ableism? Maybe some other language that's kind of along the lines of the R word. Calling somebody a spaz. Do you know what that relates to? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What'd you say? Okay. Yeah. So when maybe like muscles are really tight or they have spasms, that can be a way that sort of you're taking someone's real lived experience and sort of using it very flippantly. So that's a great example. Other examples that aren't language related is like, think about if this classroom didn't have these desks right here and somebody came in who can't do the stairs. Well, where are they going to sit? Or what are they going to use for a tabletop to write on? So that would be an example of a space that is an ableist space. Another thing that we don't think about, so doorknobs, there's actually ADA, so the Americans with Disability Act, ADA compliant doorknobs. You should be able to get through a door without having to use your thumbs. So if it's just the round doorknob, there's no way you can open that, or it's really tough, like to try to do it with both your elbows, So doors we should either be able to push them or they should have a lever on them so you can get it open without using your thumb. So those are some other examples of ableism. Might also do things like assuming because somebody has lost one sense that they've lost other senses. So if they're blind, you might find yourself talking really loud to them or talking really slow. And that's based on sort of this, what's usually an unconscious or unintentional assumption that they can't hear, or maybe they're not very smart. So those are other examples of ableism. So the flip side of ableism is able-bodied privilege. So if you've taken any class and talked about sexism, you might have talked about male privilege. If you've talked about racism, you might have talked about white privilege. So this kind of privilege isn't like when you were little and you got the privilege of like staying up late. It's not like a reward that's necessarily granted on an individual basis, but it's rewards that are given to people that are basically unearned, and they're given to a whole group of people, right? So there are a lot of different examples, and I'm going to actually have let a video give us an example of what able-bodied privilege can look like, and then we'll talk about it a little more. So this guy, he actually came to campus in the fall. His name's Tim Weiss. He does a lot of anti-racism work. And so his talk here is actually about racism, but he does a nice job of giving an example of what able-bodied privilege looks like. So hopefully it's not so loud that we're going to get blasted here.
Their life better than we do. Shocking, radical kind of thought. Or even more basic, let's say at the most basic level to understand what I mean by the privilege of obliviousness. Think about like able-bodied and disabled. I don't even know how I got into this room tonight. And it's not because I have particularly bad short-term memory. I mean, I do have these two little children, and they do suck my brain matter badly. You know, I forget a lot of stuff. But I got a good enough short-term memory. It's not that. It's that I didn't really have to pay attention to how I got in here. I don't remember if there were steps. And now that I'm thinking about it, there weren't, I don't think. But I didn't have to think about that because as an able-bodied person, let's be honest, we're all only temporarily so. If we live long enough, we'll all probably have some kind of disability or infirmity. But as a temporarily able-bodied person, I had the luxury of not knowing what people with disabilities face in terms of the obstacles, discrimination, mistreatment, barriers to access. I don't have to give thought to like, how long am I going to take to get from this place to this place? If there's a fire, God forbid, how do I get out? These are not things I have to sweat. And the fact that I don't think about them, that doesn't make me a bad person. Doesn't make me intentionally oppressive to the disabled, right? It just means that I have the luxury of having one less thing to think about that gives me a leg up in just about any situation or any setting, because I have one less thing to think about in a hyper-competitive society environment. And if we want to know if disabled folks face obstacles, who are you going to ask? Me? I just told you, I don't even know. I didn't even pay attention to how I got in. If you want to know if disability is an issue for folks who have it, you need to ask them. And then when they tell you, believe them and don't think they're insane. Same.
Okay. So there's a lot of things in there. Any reactions to it or like new information that you weren't aware of? No thoughts or reactions? Okay, well, I'll share a couple of the things that for me really stood out. One is this idea that people with able-bodied privilege, it's not something that, it's not something we're usually aware of, right? Probably most of you walked in here and didn't really think about how you were going to get up the stairs, or whether you were going to be able to access the content of this presentation, whether it's be able to hear me or see me, you know. And that's the case for most of us. And so it's this piece of like, hey, these are things we don't have to think about. And if you don't have to think about them, it's just one less stressor in your life, you know, versus somebody who might have to think about those things. The other thing is that just because you have able-bodied privilege or any kind of social privilege doesn't make you a bad person, right? Like, we can't control how we were or weren't born, whether it's the color of our skin or how our limbs or our senses work or how our brain works. We have no control over that. It doesn't make us oppressive intentionally, but it is stuff that's important for us to be aware of, because if we're not paying attention to it, then we may unintentionally do some harm or be problematic for other people. Like if I decided, you know what, I don't feel like making a PowerPoint today for this presentation. Well, what if somebody came and they can't hear me, but it would be really helpful and they could still learn from the presentation? Or even the person who made that YouTube video we just watched, they didn't close caption it, right? So if you were watching it and you couldn't hear it, but you could see it, well, now that content is useless to you, unless you can read really fast lips in a fuzzy video, which is probably not very likely, right? So those things are ways that we who have able-bodied privilege might unintentionally make life harder for people who have different abilities. Does that make sense? Cool. So, what is the big deal? Why am I even spending my time doing a presentation on this topic, right? So if we think about language specifically, I think a lot of us heard the phrase when we were growing up, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? So it doesn't really matter what somebody says to you, like just get over it, you're fine. So why even then do a presentation on language, on able-bodied, or ableism and ableist language? So let's first start by just brainstorming with the person sitting next to you or in front of you or wherever, or in a group of 3 if we need to. Why it might even be important to have a conversation about ableism, able-bodied privilege, and language, or ableist language. So what were some of the ideas that you all came up with as to why this might be an important topic or why it's worth spending some time talking about it? Seems like the two of you here in the front had some ideas or talked a little more in depth. Do you mind sharing, one of you?
So we talked about like how it's not something that people can control. That's the life that they were given, and that's their reality. And to just throw it around so flippantly, like, this is what I go through every single day, and you're just gonna like use it as a big joke. Like, that's not ethical. That's not right. That's feelings get hurt very easily. So.
Mm-hmm. So there's this piece around sort of the respect of people's lived experiences, sort of not making light of them or making a joke of them, not using them sort of flippantly. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Other ideas that you all had? What about you guys over here? What'd you come up with? Here, will you pass the mic over? Thanks.
I think we spoke about how, like, unless, like, depending on your background, you might never, like, ever think about these things, and it's important to discuss them so you become aware, and it can influence your future decisions about what language you use and how you interact with people.
Sure. Yeah, it's totally not, our fault what our circumstances are, and we're certainly sort of boxed in by our experiences, which can be limited. And so talking about it can increase our awareness, can increase our understanding, just the awareness of other people's different experiences, and maybe trigger some more thoughtfulness about like what language we use and how it might impact the people around us. I think one of the things that is really important to note is that this language is dehumanizing. And dehumanizing means it sort of takes the person and makes them less of a person, or implies they're less of a person. And so we're not just talking about like using nice language because people are really sensitive. It's actually, we have lots of data that shows that using problematic language actually has really significant effects on people's both physical and mental health. So it can be really stressful. For example, say that you were a person who had been diagnosed with mental retardation and then heard people use the R word just really flippantly, or to talk about stuff they didn't like, saying like, this homework assignment is so the R word. What that would feel like in terms of, your own stress that you might experience. Another example of how this can really affect people's health and well-being. Oh, sorry, I didn't finish that thought. So, and what we know about stress, when people experience a lot of stress or a stress for a really long period of time, is it actually damages our immune system. So the stress hormones, particularly cortisol that's released, has a negative or deleterious effect on our immune system. So when people are experiencing stress for a long time, they can actually become more physically ill. So that's one way it affects physical health. A way it affects people's mental health. So this is a personal example. Before I moved to Kansas, I lived in another state. I did private practice in another state. And I was working with a college student there. And so she was coming to see me because she had bipolar disorder. And she'd actually been diagnosed with bipolar disorder 3 times before I saw her. But this was the first time she actually did treatment. And the reason she came is because before, when she heard the term bipolar disorder, the only association she had with it was people saying things like, oh my God, the weather is so bipolar right now. And for her, the only thing she knew about bipolar disorder was it meant crazy. And she didn't want to be crazy. So she didn't do anything about it. She didn't take medication, and she didn't do any sort of psychotherapy or vocational services or anything like that. And so it continued to affect her. And one of the things to know about bipolar disorder is that if you don't treat it, it gets worse. So the reason she came to see me is that she was in an abnormal psychology class, learned what bipolar disorder was, thought, oh, like that is what I'm experiencing. Now I actually know what it is instead of just this like association with being crazy, and thought, okay, like I need to get help for this. So for her, it was like she went probably, I think it was like 4 years from the first time she was diagnosed until I saw her. So 4 years of dealing with a psychological disorder that is treatable, hard to treat sometimes, but treatable, that she dealt with untreated because of that stigma and association and hearing people say stuff like, well, they're so bipolar. So it's not just about like being really sensitive and holding people with kid gloves. It's like this stuff actually has detrimental effects on people's lives. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit, just a short activity, because I think it helps us kind of to start thinking about additional language than the couple of examples that I've thrown out already. So I've got these 3 categories on the board because they represent 3 different types, really broad different types of abilities. So we've got mental ability or disability, so we can think about like cognitive functioning or intelligence is what we're talking about with mental here. Emotional is like the feeling side of things. Health, emotional well-being, that kind of thing. And then physical health, physical well-being, how our bodies, limbs, senses are functioning physically, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is come up with words, just brainstorm some words that describe when somebody is experiencing a healthy or kind of it's functioning as we would expect it to typically function, mental health, emotional health, and physical health. So we won't use the mic, but just call out some terms like when somebody's healthy, what do we think about them in terms of their mental state or their mind? Focused? Yeah, that's a great one. What are some other ones? And we don't have to stick just with the mental. We can go with emotional or physical. Calm. Where do you think that one fits best? Mental? Say it again? Yeah, I agree. So we'll put it in both. Other words? Healthy? Yeah, where should we put that one?
Make it work with all 3, but...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can put it in all 3. Others?
Balance for mental.
Balance, sure. What about something along the lines of like, I don't know, like smart or intelligent for mental, like how the mind is working? Okay. Let's try to come up with 1 or 2 more for emotional and physical. In shape? Yeah. Ooh. Strong? Sure. Well, which one? I guess I made an assumption. We're talking about physical. Okay. So, mentally and physically? Yeah, I was actually just thinking the same thing. Any other ideas? Okay. So now let's think about words that are used to describe a problematic state. So problematic mental state, emotional state, and physical state. And so let's stay away from like the labels we use for those people and just describe with like adjectives some ways that we might describe an unhealthy or unwell mental, emotional, and physical state. What's that? Flustered. Flustered? For which one? Mental? Overwhelmed, sure. Unstable? For? Okay. Anywhere else? For which one? Physical? Weak? Okay. Oops. What else? What about one or two more, since mental is just hanging out with one right now? I can come up with another one. Paranoid? Sure. Anxious? For which one? Mental? Yeah, I think some other ones we could have used too, when we think about a mental state, so not just like the feeling stuff, but also like dumb is another word that gets used when people's brains aren't working. The way we expect them to, that might be another one. Handicapped or disabled, I think sometimes gets used for physical. Okay, so then the last thing we're going to do is identify some stereotypes or some names that we call people who might identify with having a mind that doesn't work as we would expect it to, or aren't functioning emotionally as we'd expect them to, or physically. So, what are the names that we use? Yeah, I think that could go either inside or outside of the circle, either an adjective, you're detached, or a label. So, detached. Drama queen. Is that for emotional, I'm guessing? Yeah. Attention seeker for which one? Okay, you can put it in the middle maybe. For both of them. Crippled. Any last ideas? I think these are some really good examples. And if you take a look, you can kind of see how when we go sort of the words in orange then kind of bleed into the words in blue, right? So if we start to have sort of these feelings or the sense about people that, oh, they're unstable or they're overwhelmed or they're weak, it can lead to then some pretty derogatory language or labels that we put on those folks. That they're crippled, that the person is a drama queen, that they're attention seeking, okay? So, I think it's important to think about, instead of using this kind of language, what other options do you have, or what can you do instead, okay? So this video does a nice job of giving some ideas of some alternatives.
It's not acceptable to call me a nigger.
It's not acceptable to call me a spick.
To call me a chink.
To call me a fag.
It's not acceptable to call me a kike.
And it's not acceptable to call me a retard or call yourself or your friends retarded when they do something foolish.
The R word is the same as every minority slur. Treat it that way and don't use it.
Spread the word to end the word.
There's also, has anybody seen the video? It just came out called Not Special Needs. Oh. Okay, if we have time at the end, I'll show it to you. It's a really cool, so March 21st was World Down Syndrome Day. And so the video has a number of people in it who have Down syndrome. And it gets at this idea that like it is not okay to call us special needs or say we have special needs. And so they kind of, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek that like it would be special needs if we had to eat dinosaur eggs for breakfast or be massaged by a cat. But those are not our special needs, right? Like we have needs of being loved, of having jobs, of being educated, and those aren't special. Like everyone has those needs. So I think it's a really cool video that just came out. So if you haven't seen it, like I said, I'll try to find it if we have time. Otherwise, it's something that is worth checking out. So since we're running low on time, instead of us brainstorming ideas, I'll just jump right to some other examples of things that you might say instead of sort of the problematic language that we tend to just use without even really thinking about it. And I do want to make sure I say that, you know, this language is stuff that we all use, right? Like we all learned it growing up and it just was sort of presented as like no big deal. And so it's important to know that like if you find yourself using it or somebody else you know uses it, it doesn't inherently make them a bad person, and that I don't think is a very helpful way of spinning it. But coming up with some other ideas instead. So instead of, another way that often people will talk about somebody is being OCD, right? So OCD isn't just actually a need for things to be like neat and tidy, even though that's often how we use it in sort of everyday speech. Like in actual OCD, people have thoughts that they cannot control, and they're so intrusive they just take up their mind all the time. And they have compulsive behaviors that they have to engage in, otherwise their level of anxiety is intolerable. So it really can impair people's functioning. So if you're talking about someone being really meticulous or neat or picky, just using those words instead of using OCD as a replacement. The weather has been so bipolar lately, so I gave that example before. What are some suggestions of what somebody might use instead of using the word bipolar to describe the weather? Yeah. Yeah, those are great ideas. Up and down, changing a lot, unpredictable, all over the place. So it's kind of saying exactly what you're meaning, using the description instead of a label. How about with crazy? She's crazy. Any ideas? Something that you don't think would be good?
That you don't think can be done.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so if it's like she's crazy because she's doing something that's like unbelievable and like maybe not feasible, you might say she's really ambitious. Or if the crazy is being used because it's like, wow, this is really outrageous or really unpredictable or wild, you might use that word instead. Crazy can take on a lot of different meanings. But I think it's important to know, usually or often we use crazy as a way to discredit people, which is generally not helpful to them or our relationships with them. So finding a different word to describe what's going on. We talked about the R word a little bit. You might use confusing or silly or foolish. If you were going to use this example and say, what are you? The R word, also just being aware of how like labeling people and attacking people, insulting them is not generally helpful to our relationships. And then what about using the word lame? Any idea why that's even on here or where it comes from? Yeah, so lame actually goes back to having a physical disability. Being unable to walk is the actual origin of the word. And most of us don't even know that. We just know it lame as being like boring or uninspiring or stupid. But that's actually where it comes from. It's actually associated with a physical disability. So if you really wanted to be like deliberate and conservative about not using ableist language, it would also be removing things like lame from your vernacular. Okay, so those are some ideas if you want to change your own language. So do people know what I mean when I say bystander or when I'm using the word bystander here? Okay, so it's like if you see something, basically do you do something about it? So a bystander typically does not. Or might not. Basically, as a bystander, you're a witness. So what are your thoughts about just kind of letting it go versus what might you say instead if you decided not to? Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that example. You know, I think there are lots of examples where until we're informed about something, until we know about something, we might mess up. Even once you do know about it, you're probably going to blunder and screw up and say stuff that you didn't mean or that was unintentionally hurtful. So being able to pull somebody aside and say like, hey, just want you to know here's how that could have impacted people or here's how that did impact people. Yeah. Other ideas of how you might intervene if you were going to, or you might say something if you were going to?
And like they can ask why it bothers you, and it's pretty.
Sure, yeah, just owning like, I don't really like that. It's not cool. Here's why if they ask why. That it's harmful to people. There's also the piece of you never know who you're around. And a lot of disabilities or differing abilities are not visible on the surface. You know, I'm sure with my client who had bipolar disorder, the people around who said things like, oh, that's like the weather's bipolar, had no idea. right? So also being mindful, like you could be directly impacting people that you're sitting around or standing around, and they have, just because they don't look like they have some sort of disability or differing ability. Some other ideas, well, here's a list of some other ideas. One thing that I actually really like, and this was something I was introduced to not that long ago, is the idea of calling in instead of calling out. So when we call somebody out, it's basically like pointing the finger and being like, you did this crummy thing. Calling in instead is a way of letting people know, like, that was kind of a crummy thing, and showing them compassion so that you actually keep a relationship. Because most people get defensive when you call them out, right? Like, they were not asking you for any sort of feedback, and they probably don't want to be called out, especially if it's in public. So finding a way to do it where you're sort of inviting them in, saying like, hey, I know this bit of information, and I want you to know about it, and I want you to continue to have good relationships with me, and maybe good relationships with the people in your life who might be affected by that language. So I like the idea of calling in instead of calling out. I think it also helps us avoid some of the defensiveness and people like shutting down. Kind of helps us stay connected. The other thing I like on here, so this is something I use sometimes. If I'm in a public space, I might give the person feedback by just making a face, like, ooh, and then talking to them one-on-one. And letting them know, hey, yesterday when you said this, here's how it impacted me. And that can help reduce some of the shame, because when people feel shame, they don't tend to learn or change their behavior. They just get defensive and try to get rid of the shame and distance from it. So thinking about ways to let people know what's up without maybe shutting them down, I think can be helpful. So any questions? Any final thoughts? No? Well, I hope that through the course of today, maybe you learned a little bit more about what ableism is, how to spot it, and think about, if you want to maybe change some of your own language, because probably you've noticed some words that you use or thought of some words that you use, and then also maybe thinking about how you might let someone else know if they're engaging in ableist language. Cool. Well, thanks for coming today. Thanks for your participation and putting up with talking into the mic. I hope you have a good rest of the day.